Okay, go. Now it's on the table, sir.
Corn, corn, corn. Finally, we're doing a little bit on corn, right? It's because there's a lot of stuff going on, especially because the whole drama that's going in the news about Mexico losing a lawsuit against the US to import corn and Mexico, blah, 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 blah. So here's why corn is so damn important, right? Mexico is the birthplace of corn. Corn doesn't grow on its own like that, right? That was something that was nurtured and cared. It's a collaboration between humankind and Mother Earth after generations of generations of generations of breeding and cross-pollinating. We have 400 plus varieties of corn in Mexico. It is one of the most cherished national treasures is the diversity of corn. There's entire institutes that are dedicated to preserving all the different varieties of corn that exist, right? Corn is one of the staple foods of the entire American continent from North America all the way down to South America. Corn is so goddamn beautiful. So it is a monstrosity, the mutation of what the US has done with corn. But corn, for example, it was one of the biggest staple foods that Mexico had. If you look into Tenochtitlan, that was built on a lake, the Aztec Empire, where we had a city that held over 200,000 people. Biggest city on earth at the time, much bigger than anything that was in Europe. The only way that you could sustain that many people is to be able to feed that many people. And corn was the way that it was done. And it wasn't just corn. Corn was grown on chinampas. They're dope as fuck. They're like these mud soggy little islands that they have where they planted corn, but it wasn't just the corn stalk. They also planted it with the beans and they planted it with the squash because you want the nitrogen from the beans to mix with the thing of the squash and grow with the corn. They're called the Tres Hermanas, the three sisters. That's how incredibly valuable corn is, right? So two things to understand this for starters is that's what happened within Mexico within corn, and that's the value of it. On the other end of the spectrum, you have US. And the history of corn in the US is wonky, right? Because Monsanto's at the tip of it all. So what Monsanto started doing 70s, 80s, and all these other years is they realized that they could genetically modify corn. And the main thing that comes with the genetic modification is you have two things. You want it to be able to dump as much pesticides and Roundup on it as possible without killing the corn to kill all the insects. And that's why we have so much corn. And the other part is that they were able to get basically Terminator seeds, where you have a seed that you could use once and that's it. It's a sterile seed. You can't reproduce your corn. You can't save your harvest for the next one. That is the strength that Monsanto came in with. Once they figured that out, they dumped a ton of money into lobbying, a ton of money into making sure that the US gave US farmers subsidies for corn. That's why Ohio, Kansas, so many of these other states, their entire livelihood and their entire state national product is, their state product is corn. Corn is so cheap, not because the corn itself is cheap, but because the US pays so much in government subsidies. And the fucking tragedy of it is that 2/3 of the US crops are not even meant for human consumption, they're meant for animal consumption. That is what the corn in the US is for. We have two main types of corn. The US grows mostly yellow corn. That's what goes to the pigs, that's what goes to the cows, that's what goes to the chickens, that's what goes to all that stuff. And that's also what they end up dealing with to make ethanol and to make all these other things, right? That's the glyphosate, that's the Monsanto corn. That is a Terminator seed corn, which, by the way, while we're on it, the reason why it's so fucking dangerous and the reason why it's such a problem is not because of whatever genetically modified things happen within the corn. It's because they're resistant to Roundup. So what does that mean? That means that they are dumping tons and tons of pesticides on this corn, and the bacterias and the bacterias are growing more and more resistant to those pesticides. So they just keep upping the dosage of pesticides, and all those pesticides end up in our water systems. They end up in all these other places. They end up being consumed by the cows, consumed by the pigs, consumed by the chickens, and they're just flooded with pesticide exposure that we then eat them. That's why Monsanto corn's a problem.
Field workers.
And exactly, because of the soy and because of all the other shit, it spills over into the field workers. Field workers have really high pesticide exposure, really high cancer rates. And especially for me being a child of migrants who in Ventura County, it's strawberries, avocados, lemons, and oranges. Pesticide exposure is a real problem, and it's taken out a lot of our friends and family. Back to the other part of it. So in Mexico, they don't grow any of that yellow corn. In Mexico, all the corn that they grow is white corn, because white corn is the corn that we use for human consumption. White corn is delicious. That's what we use to make tortillas, sopes, all the other amazing foods that we do with corn in Mexico is that. So, yes, Mexico lost the lawsuit. Mexico lost the lawsuit that wasn't allowing, what they wanted is they wanted to stop the US from importing that yellow corn for the feed in Mexico, for the livestock feed, for the chicken feed, and for the pig feed. And the reason they don't want it planted in Mexico is for the same reason they don't want it planted in a lot of the US. Because if you're growing your indigenous native corn, it's gonna get contaminated with all the pollen and all the bullshit from the yellow corn, the US corn. So we can't have that fucking up all of the indigenous, all of the white corn, and all of these preserved, nationally praised and beloved corn. That's where it comes down to. So Mexico is still they're gonna protect the fuck out of our white corn and all of our other corn varieties. But losing that lawsuit meant that yes, the US can import the corn, but it's still not getting planted within Mexican territory. And that is one of the small portions of my favorite subject of corn.
And go. You keep